take a good look at what's happening in the U.S. The 2024 presidential election is just getting more interesting. Not only that we're seeing the former U.S. President Donald Trump again took the stage, and of course, he successfully convinced the more voters at the recent Republican convention. But meanwhile, the shocking news came out that the sitting U.S. President Joe Biden decided to pull out of the race. Now, who is going to be the next person able to lead the Democratic Party and also to compete with Donald Trump? Again, when we look at this complication of the U.S. political structure today, if you follow our show, we've been talking about, it's not about the present. We need to talk about and also acknowledge the past. Now, take a good look at the nation today. America has went through thick and thin for the past 200 years, and there's no doubt that we need to understand some of the founding fathers or some of the former U.S. presidents actually provided clear guidance and also tangible and practical advice for the future generations. How much do we know about John Quincy Adams? That's right, it's not John Adams, it's John Quincy Adams. Now, we also need to understand the role that Quincy Adams played when he was the president, or even he was becoming the president. How did his political ambition and also this political move actually changed and shaped the country and also his own destiny? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, and who is Dr. Randall Woods. Dr. Randall Woods received his PhD in history from the University of Texas at Austin in 1972. He has been employed continuously as a faculty member at the University of Arkansas since 1971, being promoted from instructor to distinguished professor. And of course, recently he came out with this amazing book. It's called John Quincy Adams. Well, Dr. Woods, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you for having me, Will. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, Dr. Woods, the honor and the pleasure is all mine. Now, again, as we mentioned before, there's no surprise that today the American political system is getting more complicated and, of course, is getting more interesting. Now, before we talk about what's happening today, I want to dive into your book talk about John Quincy Adams. And we all know that throughout history, we tend to say that people are the product of the environment. Before we talk about John Quincy Adams and go in your book, you actually talk about John Adams and also Abigail. Now, I want to read something to you, want to get you further explanation. You wrote, and I quote, "Increasingly, John and Abigail's formidable ambition for themselves and also their country were focused on John Quincy. And I hope that you will remember how many losses, dangers, and inconveniences been borne by your parents and the inhabitants of Boston in general for the sake of preserving freedom for you and yours." And we know that John Adams had a great ambition. Of course, Abigail and John Adams, they were greater patriots for the country. Now, what kind of environment did John and Abigail set for John Quincy? And how do you think, as a parent, they expect their son to understand this patriotism and also to preserving freedom for the country? What do you say to that?
Well, John and Abigail Adams were, present at the birth of the nation. They were both, although not wealthy people, very well educated, very well connected in the colonies. John Adams, a member of the Continental Congress and one of the architects of the Declaration of Independence, was among the best-read people in the colonies. He was steeped in classical history and modern history, political philosophy. His wife was self-educated, but very well educated. Both were fluent in French. They read, they talked with the best and brightest, and their eldest son, John Quincy, who by current estimates had an IQ of 170. Young John grew up in that environment. At the Battle of Bunker Hill, he stood with his mother, holding hands, watching that battle. His parents were intoxicated with being part of the creation of the first modern republic
Mm.
and the world in a sea of monarchies determined to destroy them. So Quincy Adams, but more than that, his father went to France in 1778 during the Revolution to oversee the treaty with France, and he took John Quincy with him. Quincy was 11. And with one small break, John Quincy was with his father in Europe until 1785 when he returned to go to Harvard.
Mm.
So he was his father's companion, but he also met and talked with all of the important ministers of state, the politicians, the cultural leaders of Europe. And by the time he returned to the U.S., John Quincy, at 18, was the best traveled American of his generation, and as much European as he was American. He went to Harvard, earned a law degree, and then joined the diplomatic corps, served his country during the wars of the French Revolution. And throughout that period, his parents instilled in him not only an intense patriotism, but the notion that he was unique and that that his life would be dominated by service to his country.
Mm.
And he embraced that. He went on to his father lost the election of 1800. Thomas Jefferson came to power. Quincy Adams served in the Senate, but then switched to the Republican Party. He was a U.S. ambassador to Russia, Imperial Russia, and became very close to Alexander I.
Mm.
And during the Napoleonic Wars, and was that relationship would become extremely important. Quincy Adams negotiated the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812.
Mm.
Then returned to the U.S. and served as James Monroe's Secretary of State. Probably he's best known for his role as Secretary of State because he was the spokesman, the avatar for Manifest Destiny. This notion that the United States was destined to occupy all of North America. And Quincy Adams negotiated the Transcontinental Treaty, which extended America's boundary, helped extend America's boundary to the West Coast. He was the driving force behind the Monroe Doctrine, which was declared the Western Hemisphere to be America's sphere of interest and warning Europe to stay out of U.S. affairs.
Mm.
He served, as you mentioned, as the sixth president. It wasn't a successful presidency. His program for America was compelling. He was a nationalist. He believed in an active government that built roads and highways and promoted business, a national university, so forth. Adams not only was an architect of the U.S. in a political and territorial sense, he was aware that the country was brand new and really was born in an emergency.
Mm.
And unlike other nations of the world, from the Western powers or China, we had no history. So he actively tried to create a sense of identity for the United States. Its own literature, its own history. He collaborated with Noah Webster in creating the first American dictionary. He was a great rhetorician, a great speaker, and during the presidency and afterwards, in speech after speech, he helped imagine America, imagine what the United States was. So, and as you say, he's a kind of link between the original founding fathers and the later period, the Jacksonian period. You know, his life he was. When he was 11, he went to the opera in Paris with his father and sat next to Voltaire.
Mm.
When he died in 1848, Abraham Lincoln was at his bedside.
Mm.
So you can see how his life spread across the early republic into the middle years. And he was when he was in the House after he left the presidency, and perhaps his most interesting period, he was the scourge of the slave power. He introduced legislation to eliminate the three-fifths clause in the Constitution, which allowed Southerners to count slaves as three-fifths of a person. He introduced legislation to abolish slavery. So he was a very interesting man in his own right, but it was a way for me as an historian to look at the development of the country across those years.
Dr. Woods, I want to talk about, again, this is something that you briefly mentioned about John Quincy Adams. It's one of the fundamental elements that shaped who he was, which is the word education. And also, of course, that in your book, you mentioned that John Adams, that he tried to persuade John Quincy to preserve copies of his letters and to begin a diary, which by the end of a long life would become one of the most significant memoirs in the English language. So from your perspective, why do you think it's so important for John Adams to tell Quincy Adams to develop the skills of writing or even to preserve the copies of his letters? And also by examining those letters, by looking at the memoir that written by John Quincy Adams, how does that help us to understand who he actually was? I mean, again, how significant was the preservation of those letters or of those diaries, etc.? What do you say to that?
Well, I mean, it's absolutely crucial, and it's Quincy Adams' diary, 7,000 pages, is, as you're right, considered one of the great memoirs in the English language. These people were avid letter writers. Abigail and John Quincy and his wife Louisa, together more than 2,000 letters. And so there is this body of literature which enabled me to write, I think, a fairly rich biography. But also, you talked about education. John and John Quincy were absolutely convinced that the only way a virtuous republic, could endure was through an educated electorate. And I mean liberal arts education, which included science, literature, history, because in a republic, the stability of the government depended upon not coercion from above, but consent from below, and that consent had to be informed consent. One of the politics began to change in the 1820s with the rise of Andrew Jackson and the spread of the franchise and the lowering of qualifications for voting. And you see the beginning of modern politics, favor trading, backslapping, cultivation of the crowd. John and John Quincy were appalled by that. They believed that an educated public ought to recognize ability in their leaders and voluntarily elect them, and that was naive on their part. But again, they believed that a virtuous republic was absolutely dependent upon an educated public.
Dr. Woods, I want to talk about another unique perspective. Let's talk about the presidency of John Quincy Adams. I mean, again, we know that being a president, it's not easy. I mean, again, we're looking at the political division, or even some call it the political polarization today. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, that no one would ever expect that America today is so divided. And I don't just mean politically, on many issues. But from your perspective, looking back the presidency of John Quincy Adams, was there or were there any political division or any type of political polarization, if we can use the terms today, that during his presidency? And how in your book, of course, that you documented thoroughly, but the point is, how did John Quincy Adams actually understood this intricacy or a complicated structure of the political system, and also able to delegate those tasks without running into political polarization, or we call it political division. Can you walk us through a little bit more on that?
He grew up in an America that was deeply divided. The wars of the French Revolution, Napoleonic Wars, pitted France and its allies against Britain and its allies. Both of them tried to, we were a neutral country, tried to trade with both sides. Both of them tried to control the country economically. Britain plotted to recolonize the colonies. Both the French and British had factions that dominated American politics, and Adams actually spoiled a plot in the early 19th century in which New England planned to secede from the Union. He exposed that plot. So he navigated those waters. By the time he became president, however, both the Federalist Party had disappeared, and there was only one party, the Republican Party, which would later splinter. But slavery had become a major issue in the Republic. Also, Indian removal, and the country was divided economic's between the commercial and financial Northeast and agricultural and slaveholding South and West. Adams's plan, his so-called American plan that he put forth when he was president, was to try to make the various sections of the country economically interdependent, to create a national economy in which the agricultural interest and the commercial and financial interest would be absolutely dependent on each other. And he hoped that interdependency would lead to unity, would transcend other issues. And they did for a time, but in the end, of course, the dispute over slavery led finally to civil war.
Dr. Woods, I want to talk about another important piece which focuses on the topic of protection of private property rights and the power and the duty of the federal government to regulate the economy. I mean, again, this is something that, again, as I mentioned before, of course, I want to remind our readers, this is one of the amazing books that I was able to get started this summer, again, written by Dr. Woods on John Quincy Adams. But I strongly encourage everyone really to go online and also or go to the bookstore to grab a copy of this book, because it helps us to understand so much. It's not just about John Quincy Adams. It's more about the value and the treasure for American history. But anyway, Dr. Woods, let's go back to the question. In the book, you also mentioned, and I wrote, and I quote, both John and John Quincy Adams were Hamiltonians when it came to protection of private property rights and the power and the duty of the federal government to regulate the economy in the national interest. Now, Dr. Woods, help us with better understanding, because today when we talk about protection of the private property rights and the power and the duty of the federal government, I mean, again, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's rather controversial today. And also, it's rather sensitive. So, since you mentioned and you wrote that John and John Quincy Adams were Hamiltonians, so what does that mean? That when it came to protection of the private property rights and the power and the duty of the federal government, how important is that for us to understand this correlation between being the Hamiltonians and also the protection of the private property? What do you say to that?
Well, Alexander Hamilton was the first Secretary of the Treasury. He was responsible for really creating the first American economy. It was based on, he advocated a national bank to regulate the currency. His plan called for a sound and stable currency, federal subsidies to private business. So John and John Quincy believed in that these people, they were capitalists. They were defenders of private property. There was no tendency while they wanted a strong and active federal government, they wanted that government to act to promote free enterprise and protect private property. They didn't believe that the government had the right to confiscate wealth and redistribute it. That was an anathema to them. They were very conservative in that sense. They wanted the federal government to stimulate both private enterprise, both agricultural and commercial and financial. And in fact, when he was in Congress, one of the things that prevented John Quincy Adams from urging the federal government to use force to emancipate the slaves was his respect for private property. He believed in compensated emancipation. His respect for private property, even when it came to the ownership of slaves, really trumped everything else. So they were fosterers, encouragers of free enterprise.
Well, Dr. Woods, I got two more questions before letting you go. Now, let's talk about towards the end of the book that, of course, it's sad to read and also to understand that John Quincy Adams passed away, but this is the way how you wrote it, which is quite unique for the readers to interpret the meaning behind the words. And it says, in death, John Quincy Adams perhaps experienced the peace that he had never known during his life. He was at last free from himself, his family's ambitions, and the paradox of a nation that he loved and served that at times had bound him hand and foot. Professor Woods, help us with better understanding. What does that mean, especially when you wrote that Quincy Adams perhaps experienced the peace he had never known during his life? What was the peace that it was unknown to John Quincy Adams? And what does that mean that he was finally free from himself and from the family's ambitions, etc.? What do you say to that?
Well, he was his father wrote him when Quincy Adams was in Russia in 1815. It's very cold. It was very difficult, and he wrote his father and he said, "I'm thinking about returning home and retiring from public life." And his father said, "That will never happen. You were born to nurture this republic. It is the only mistress you'll ever know. And for better or worse, that is your destiny." And so Adams was not only selfless, he was selfless in service to his country, but he was incredibly ambitious. He even after he was president and in the Congress, he hoped to become president again, either with the Whig Party or the anti-Masonic Party. So he was, in a sense, a prisoner of his parents' vision of him as a public servant for all of his life, and he was also a prisoner of his own ambition. And he was, above all, I think, committed to preserving the Union. He told his father, he said, "You're obsessed with balance of power within the federal government. I'm concerned with the Union." And he was essential to the growth of the country across the Midwest and into the West. But he came to realize in later life that had facilitated the spread of slavery. That his lifelong commitment to seeing the U.S. Occupy all of North America had also facilitated the spread of slavery, which he considered a moral abomination. And so he at the end of his life, he was conflicted about his legacy. Had he done more in an effort to do good? Had he done more harm than good? So that's what and so he was. It weighed heavily upon him during his life. So that's what I mean about being free, I think.
Well, again, Dr. Woods, it's hard to imagine to be the son for John Adams. Of course, I mean, again, putting today's term, I believe it's tough. It's really hard to have a conversation with someone like John Adams, and of course, even with Abigail Adams as well, especially rather patriotic and also believe that the son was born with the destiny and was born with a mission to serve and save the country. Now, Dr. Woods, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, your book is called John Quincy Adams. Let's talk about what's happening today in the U.S. Political division, social controversies, and cultural intricacy as well. And of course, that 2024, it's rather crucial. Putting everything together, we don't know who will be the next president, and we don't know what will happen to the country. What do you hope the readers to understand and appreciate when we finish reading the last chapter of your book, as we continue to pay attention to what's happening today in the U.S.? What will be the best aspects or elements that we should learn from John Quincy Adams as we continue to pay attention to the political system, to pray for our country, and of course, to understand the future destiny for America? I want to hear your final thoughts.
The lesson is the absolute value of liberal education to a functioning democracy. The issues here today are so trivial in comparison to issues of the past, World War II, Cold War. All of the culture wars, and during the Reagan administration, the Republican Party unfortunately decided to make war against public education, and they have succeeded. So that now it's estimated that 51% of American people did not read a single book last year. The vast majority of voters have no sense of the past, and if they have no sense of the past, if they don't know their own history, they can't understand the present. We're losing. One of the reasons I wrote this book is to try to revive. America's losing its sense of identity. We don't know. We don't know who we are. We don't know where we came from. I have students who don't know which came first, the Revolutionary War or the Civil War, and they come through high school and into college. So throughout our history, there's been a kind of meaningful dialogue between conservatives and liberals or progressives over major issues, the role of the federal government in the economy, foreign policy. Now we're consumed with trivial, how people dress, what they wear, where do they go to the bathroom, those kinds of things. If Quincy Adams were to look back, sort of not taking sense, he would be appalled by the triviality of public debate during these years. So the only way we're going to get out of this is if we learn about our past, understand about where we came from, and what it means to be a virtuous republic. We're going to continue to lose our way, I think.
Well, Dr. Woods, I agree with you 100%. And again, from my perspective, it's not just about John Quincy Adams. I believe if any of the founding fathers could look at what's happening today, and I believe majority of them would be appalled, by what's happening. Again, as we mentioned before, this cultural debates and those value debates, and again, the most important and also the threatening issue that we're facing today, especially among the younger generations, is the word identity. So that's why I want to emphasize to our viewers and also our listeners one more time that this is such an amazing book, and again, it came out at a critical time for us not just to understand about John Quincy Adams, but also to understand the lessons and also the absolutely irreplaceable those elements and aspects from John Quincy Adams and, of course, from the Adams family that we need to learn and also we need to appreciate. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, it's such a great honor to speak to Dr. Randall Woods. And Dr. Randall Woods, has been employed continuously as a faculty member at the University of Arkansas. And I strongly encourage everyone go online to check out his amazing and a fantastic book. It's called John Quincy Adams. Well, Dr. Woods, it's been a pleasure. Again, I wish we have more than 3 hours to talk about everything, regarding John Quincy Adams. But meanwhile, I know you're very busy. You have a full day ahead of you. And again, thank you so much for your time. We love to have you back on the show. Not only just about the founding fathers, not only just about American history, it's really about the value and also about those missing pieces that we need to address and also we need to talk about today. So thank you so much for doing this. It's such an honor and pleasure to speak to you.